Hello all, welcome back to another Tidal Gardens Coral Spotlight. In these spotlights, we like to cover background information on the various types of corals and provide some care tips to keep them thriving. This video is all about Cynarina and Indophyllia. I'm lumping these two genera of corals together because they look similar and it is very common for them to be mistaken for one another. They are challenging to tell apart, and what I tend to look for is how pronounced their flesh lobes are. Cynarina tend to have a more bubbly appearance, while Indophyllia tend to have a smoother appearance similar to that of Acanthophylia. In fact, years ago, Indophyllia were often lumped in together with Acanthophylia. These corals are found all throughout the Indo-Pacific and the Great Barrier Reef, but they are somewhat uncommon in the hobby. The most spectacular colored specimens are highly sought after, and they can serve as a signature showpiece in a large polyp stony dominated tank. Speaking of aesthetics, both Cynarina and Indophyllia have an interesting translucence to their flesh, giving them a unique appearance. I love the way that you can see their septa, and the way that it catches the light makes the coral look like it's glowing from the inside. These corals come in a variety of colors and combination of colors, which altogether has this aurora borealis-like appearance as the colors transition from one to the other. Now that we've covered just a little bit of background information on these corals, let's get into some of the care tips. Starting with lighting, Cynarina and Indophyllia are photosynthetic corals. They get nutrients from the products of photosynthesis carried out by symbiotic dinoflagellates called zooxanthellae living in their flesh. Zooxanthellae utilize chlorophyll to absorb light and produce simple sugars that the coral can then consume for energy. These corals tend to be less demanding for light than most. They probably fare better in less intense lighting conditions, and they do well on the bottom of the aquarium. We primarily keep Cynarina and Indophyllia in low to medium light intensity, which is around 50 to 100 par. These corals are adaptable. So if your tank is higher in light, fear not, it will just take some time for the coral to adjust. When in doubt, try lower lighting intensities until it is clear that the coral is stable before ramping it back up. If you start to see the coral turning lighter and bleaching out, it's time to move it to a dimmer location. There really isn't much benefit to blasting them with more light. They don't change color that much. They're very consistent in that regard. While these corals tend to stay consistent, the color temperature of the lighting will make a massive difference on their appearance for display purposes. If your tank is primarily daylight colored and you prefer that color temperature for your tank, you may be disappointed by the appearance of Cynarina and Indophyllia. They have a fairly dull appearance in white light and only start to display their subtle color and fluorescence under heavy actinic. Although Cynarina and Indophyllia can survive just relying on photosynthesis without any kind of direct feeding, they are also one of the easiest corals to feed if you wanted to. We have tried feeding a number of different types of food, ranging from frozen foods such as krill and mysis to pellet foods and powdered foods. They are capable of dramatic feeding displays, so it is no mystery when they are consuming food. Setting aside some time each week to do a targeted feeding may help with overall growth and health. I like to turn off all the pumps and gently place some food on them with a turkey baster. After about 10 to 20 minutes, I turn the flow back on to wash away anything that they were not able to consume in that time frame. This may or may not work out well for you, depending on what fish and inverts that you have in your system. Certain fish and shrimp might try to dig the food out of the coral, making the whole exercise a net negative. If you're committed to the idea of direct feeding though, consider employing a feeding cage of some sort to prevent fish and inverts from harassing the coral. Speaking of turning pumps on and off, let's address water flow recommendations for these corals. In my opinion, less is more, with a big asterisk. You want just enough to carry away detritus and other waste, but not so much that their flesh is pressed up against their skeleton. Also, While most people have these corals situated at the bottom of the aquarium, there's plenty out there that place them on the rockwork. If the water flow is too strong, you risk blowing the corals off of the rocks because their bodies can act like a parachute and lift it right up off the aquascape. Here's where the asterisk comes into play. This next bit is going to sound a little bit contradictory. If I were to design a flow pattern from scratch for these corals, I would have a slow current that changes direction where the coral sits. This is something best accomplished by multiple smaller powerheads that come on and off on a program. But then, I would have a more powerful powerhead that sends water indirectly over the top of the entire aquascape that fires relatively infrequently. The idea behind this is to provide strong, intermittent flow to wash away anything that might have collected on the coral. And this is a general recommendation that I have for a lot of LPS that don't typically like a lot of flow. Even for those corals that I recommend low flow for, strong indirect flow can have its benefits. Changing gears, let's talk about everybody's favorite topic, water chemistry. In short, try not to overthink this. For the most part, we shoot for tested values in the neighborhood of natural seawater levels. Big surprise. Cynarina and Indophyllia are slow-growing stony corals and don't quickly deplete any particular ion. But the overall stocking of your reef aquarium is likely going to play a bigger part in levels rising or falling. If you want the most simple chemistry framework imaginable, just keep up with your regular water changes and pay attention to the major parameters needed for skeletal growth, as well as parameters that correlate to water cleanliness. Starting first with skeletal formation, these corals require consistent levels of calcium, alkalinity, and to a lesser degree magnesium. Key word there is consistent. I would go as far as saying it's better to keep suboptimal levels of calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium, again, consistent rather than trying to fix low levels overnight with additives. Real quick, calcium is one of the major ions in salt water. In the ocean, its level hovers right around 425 parts per million. As a coral grows, calcium is absorbed from the water and deposited in the form of calcium carbonate. Alkalinity is a collection of ions that generally equate to carbonate availability in the water. It is the amount of acid required to lower the pH of salt water to the point where bicarbonate turns into carbonic acid. If you have more of these ions present in the water, the solution can soak up more acid. Less alkalinity and you have less buffering capacity, making the tank more susceptible to chemical changes. So, you want to keep your alkalinity high and stable. In practice, alkalinity tends to be the parameter that fluctuates the most. Natural seawater has alkalinity hovering right around 7 or 8 DKH. That stands for degree of carbonate hardness. Though most salt mixes these days mix up closer to 8 to 9 DKH. If you are experiencing low levels, say for example, low alkalinity, you can add a supplement to boost it. But first, double check your test results and test kit to make sure that you're actually experiencing low values. And then make the changes slowly over the course of weeks until you reach a level more in line with natural seawater levels. Magnesium is the third parameter that plays a supporting role in skeletal formation in corals. Raising both calcium and alkalinity together can sometimes be tricky because of how they interact. They want to form calcium carbonate, so calcium ions and carbonate want to react with one another. Addition of a calcium supplement often comes with a corresponding fall in alkalinity levels and vice versa. If you're experiencing this in your systems, it is normal just by the very nature of these ions, but it's something that you want to try and minimize. If these values are swinging dramatically, so you're getting big upshots and collapses of calcium and alkalinity every time that you use an additive, you might want to get a magnesium test kit and get an idea of what's going on there. In short, magnesium acts to increase the overall bioavailability of alkalinity compounds in the water, thus providing more chemical stability. In the ocean, magnesium sits at about 1350 parts per million. Alright, calcium, alkalinity, magnesium aside, stony corals like Cynarina and Indophyllia are sometimes more sensitive to declining water quality. In particular, pay attention to elevated nitrate levels. Low nitrate levels around 5 to 10 parts per million are actually nice for large polyp stony corals, but right around 30 to 40 parts per million of nitrate and you might start running into some issues. Usually, these issues take the form of sudden tissue recession. If I see a coral suddenly start receding, my mind immediately goes to nitrate first. To remedy elevated nitrates, I look to up nutrient removal through more aggressive protein skimming, detritus removal, and more frequent water changes. Alternatively, you could try to limit the nutrient input by cutting back on feeding, but I tend to favor heavier feeding and dealing with the possible overages than underfeeding because, on average, I think that most aquariums are not getting enough food. This is just me though, so it is something that you're going to have to experiment within your own system. The dynamics of feeding and the biology of your system is likely going to be very different than another hobbyist, and certainly different than a commercial coral farm like Tidal Gardens. Okay, that should give you just a little bit of background on the chemical parameters to keep an eye on. In conclusion, who do I think this coral is best suited for? I think they make a great centerpiece coral in a low-light, LPS-dominated reef. They are especially attractive in tanks that use predominantly blue light, as their color gets kind of washed out to a large degree in daylight-colored lighting. If it wasn't immediately clear, this is one of my favorite LPS out there. Alright, that does it for this coral spotlight on Cynarina and Indophyllia. I hope that you found the video helpful. If you'd like to see more on these corals or perhaps purchase one of them for your reef tank, please visit us at tidalgardens.com. As always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, happy reefing.